welcome to the very first episode of Bigger Than the Hustle, the podcast where we challenge the idea that success is just about grinding harder. Today, we're coming out swinging with a topic that might ruffle some feathers. Hustle culture is a scam. We've all been told that if we just work harder, put more hours in, and grind non-stop, we'll eventually be successful. But what if that's the biggest lie in the industry? I'm your host, Chris Benedict. I've built financial freedom and now live the life most entrepreneurs are chasing. And I know firsthand the real goal isn't just about making more money. It's about making the money without being stuck in the daily grind.
And I'm also your host, Heather Rose Boehm, a process architect and business coach who's still in the trenches, helping business owners break free from the chaos of running their company so they can scale sustainably. And if you've ever felt like you're working harder than ever, but still somehow not getting ahead, you're spinning your wheels and making no progress, then this is the episode for you.
So this is a good question. What does this, where did the hustle equal success mindset come from? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I know for me, it wasn't called hustle, but I was raised with the idea that work ethic was the utmost thing that you needed to have to get ahead in life. And, watching my parents growing up, they were both some of the hardest workers I've ever seen, and everybody praised them for that, right? They were always complimented and praised for how hard they'd work. But if you took a step back and looked at the results, they were working really hard, and it was like trying to keep up with the Joneses. So basically it was programmed into my DNA that you've got to work harder, otherwise you're not working hard enough. And I think that's something that kind of goes into the psychology of it, is if you're not working hard, you're not doing enough.
Well, I think there's that idea that somehow the grind has to be painful, and I'm not saying that there isn't pain involved. Mm-hmm. And I think the potentially the hustle kind of maybe trickled down originally from more of the sports industry, because let's face it, if you're going to be an athlete of the highest caliber in any sport, there is typically going to be some grind there. These are the people who are waking up at 5 a.m. to swim 3 hours before going to school all day and swimming another 3 hours. Just the thought of doing that every day is just beyond me. But again, that's a different kind of grind. I think what we're talking more is in the work mindset. But I think that trickled down and somehow we respect it. And there's nothing wrong getting up early in the morning, going to the gym, all that good stuff. But I think social media really kind of glorified it, and I think it glorified the fake results, if that makes sense.
And that's the thing, as a former athlete, and I'll be honest, I never really grinded because I wanted to. It was more it was something that was expected of me. But there is satisfaction when you're doing physical effort to kind of putting in that work, because you see the results, right? If you practice in a sport and you put in that effort, you're absolutely going to get an ROI there, because you are doing what it takes to drive the result. But in business, it's almost an inverse, right? Because it's almost instead of hustle, meaning the small actions that get you big results, hustle has become you're miserable, but it's supposed to be worth it because the big payout's coming. But in business, that doesn't always happen. It's like chasing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You can hustle in business and work harder and be miserable and still not have a lot come from it. If I lift weights every single day at 5 a.m. for 3 hours, I know without a shadow of a doubt that I am going to get jacked. But that's not so much true in business, because you can run around in circles doing all the wrong things but feel like you're working hard and still not get results.
Well, you could make 100 cold calls a day, and yes, will that potentially lead you to more opportunities? And those opportunities could eventually get you that you don't have to make those cold calls. But at the same point, there's no guarantee you can make 100 cold calls a day and do nothing. So that doesn't mean just because you're working harder that there's guarantee success. I think, one of the reasons why I have a hard time gambling is because I already know the house wins. So I always want to be the house. When you know the house wins, be the house. You don't want to be the gambler. You want to be the house. So it's kind of the same thing. If you already know the expected outcome is that you potentially could lose, you don't want to play the game. So I only want to play games where I know I can win or I have a higher likelihood of success.
And I think it comes down to, like, you know, if you're doing it purely for the result, that's one thing. But I think people have the hustle culture is kind of broken, because instead of thinking of hustle as like, I'm going to hustle in something that I love, right? If you're painting hours and hours, but you truly love the process of painting, and that's technically considered hustling, but you love it, right? It's like when I craft, I love crafting, and I'll spend hours crafting, and I'll get kind of like a mediocre result, because let's be honest, I'm not the best crafter, but I like the process, so it doesn't really matter that I'm not going to be like Joanna Gaines at crafting. But somehow, somewhere in like the 90s and early 2000s, hustle has become synonymous with, like, if you're not miserable, you're obviously not working hard enough, and if you're not working hard enough, you're not going anywhere. And I think that's
you're not wrong about that. I remember, especially during like the Wall Street day, like these guys were working, you know, whatever god number hours, and they were out partying at night and then getting up and doing it all over again. And it was like this idea that if you weren't working like 120-hour weeks, and believe me, there's nothing wrong with that. Anybody who's run their own business, who's caught the bug of excitement, knows that doing 120-hour work weeks doesn't seem like a lot when you feel compelled. But that's a different momentum driving you than like, if I just put in more hours and I'll just make more money, or I'll just make more success. I think that's the dangerous advice. Like, just work harder and everything will fall into place. And I think we had talked about that in other calls, where most of us, right, we need more money. So it's, what else can I add to my day? What else can I take on? And that's a recipe for burnout.
And I think it's kind of scary to, like, it's almost easier to put your head down and work harder. But what's really scary is to take a really hard look at, like, obviously all this effort I have put in is not working. So what am I really doing? And that's a lot of like reflection. And it's scary to reflect, because you have to admit that all this effort you've been putting in, I don't think it's wasted, but it's almost like your mind tricks you into thinking that. It's like, well, you wasted all this effort doing all the wrong things, and you got so burnt out, and obviously you wasted all these years or all these months. So if you admit that, well, shoot, right? Like, now I wasted all this time, but you gave me a great analogy. It's like, you could be in the fastest Ferrari in the world, full tank of gas, but if you're heading in the wrong direction, driving faster will not get you in the right direction. You have to take stock and say, oh, I'm heading north and I should be going south.
As soon as you realize that, we often say that, like, yeah, it's true. And we all do that. That analogy is a great one. I'm driving in the wrong direction. Great. Well, the sooner you turn the car around, the sooner you're on the right track. Mm-hmm. And there's no point in saying, oh, I just spent the last 2 hours driving and we've done this. I don't know if anyone else has done this. I've done it.
Yeah.
I've passed exits and been an hour and all of a sudden realized, oh man, I got to drive now all the way back. You know, but what am I supposed to do? Just keep heading west? No, at some point, like, okay, I screwed up. I got to turn around and drive back to the mountains east. It's just the way we're going to do it.
And with the road trip analogy, it seems so logical, right? Like, what am I going to do? Like, it sucks, but you got to eat it and turn around. But it's like with our lives, the stakes are higher, the game is bigger, but it's like, if we don't admit it, and that's where I get into. I always run into this problem where I'm like, I'm just going to like put my head down and ignore the fact that things aren't going super well, and it'll work itself out. And what I have come to realize is, unfortunately, it doesn't. It doesn't work itself out until you confront it, face it, and get really honest with yourself, and then take the sometimes painful steps to make changes, to turn around. And I think that's the point where people kind of psychologically avoid it, because it's like, I don't want to actually face the truth that this isn't working.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to look yourself in the mirror and realize, like, I am the cause of everything good and bad in my life. I have to tell you, when I started that 7 or 8 years ago, I actually wrote it on my mirror in dry erase marker. It was like, you are the cause of and solution to all your own problems. And that was on my mirror for a good year. So I would see that every morning, every night. And, you know, when you take full accountability for everything good and bad, you might say, well, that's not fair. Why am I taking accountability for some asshole who cut me off in traffic? Well, the reality is, it's still your responsibility, all of it. And the moment you start, and I think that's what's been failing our newest generation. I don't think it's their fault. They've been raised in a victim mentality generation. They've been told for 20 plus years they were victims. So in some respects, we owe that as the generation that raised them. It's not their fault, but what we did, whatever happened, like to account, no one says, I could be wrong, I often am. And I heard that from a comedian 20 some years ago. And man, that has gotten me out of so many sticky, argumentative situations.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I mean, your brain doesn't fully mature until you're 25, but you see so many people in their like late 30s, 40s, early 50s that go on these like self-reflective journeys. That's when a lot of people seem to come online. It's when, you start reading the personal development books, you start listening to the podcast, because all of us kind of are in our own world. And I think everybody has a different coming online moment. So that moment where you were like, I am responsible for everything good and bad that happens to me. Tell me a little bit about what led to that realization for you.
Boy, that is a good one. I think, I think you reach, I don't speak for anyone but myself, and I certainly can't speak for women. I can only speak for men. I think for men, we all mature at different rates. Some men mature very, very young. Others, we have a tendency to take a little longer. We live a little bit more in boyhood fantasy. I didn't want to grow up. I never did. I still to this day say I want to live to be 150. I don't feel at 52 that I'm old. I feel I'm young at heart, and I think that's what has helped me. But sooner or later, you get to a point where you realize, man, I really am whining a lot, aren't I? Thanks. And that's an honest. That's what I'm saying. It's and I would say for most men, it's probably going to be their late 30s, early 40s. If you really want to know the truth.
And tell me, because there's that moment where you're like, why is this always happening to me? But usually there's something like we talked about yesterday. My moment where my boss sat me down and was basically like, everything's your fault. So do you deserve the bonus, right? So what was that moment, like the situation?
The most recent one, and I won't go too into it because I'm not here to badmouth, but I was working with a business partner, and I had chosen a bad business partner. That person wasn't a bad person per se. They were just a bad business partner. They really had no business sense. Therefore, I really brought a problem into my partnership because this person didn't have the skills or the mindset and the vision of where I thought we could take it. And that was not this person's fault. In the end, it was really mine because I'm the one who sought this person out and said, hey, I think this would be good. I'm the one who was the pursuer and all these things. So that was a wake-up lesson. But I will tell you, if you've ever dealt with a narcissist.
I feel like that's a hot button word now.
Yeah, no, and I'm not talking about I'm talking about a true dyed-in-the-wool, like a narcissist who's like literally unable to empathize with anyone else's problems but their own, including their own family. You don't realize how destructive they are. And what happened was, this person would throw shit bombs, excuse my language, into emails, and it took me like 2-3 years of like constantly defending myself, constantly responding, trying to be like, no, you're wrong. And then finally one day there it was like, I am miserable. I don't want to work with this person anymore. I don't know out of it. And so I called another partner of mine who at the time was more of a mentor for me. And I said, I don't know what to do. And he's like, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. And he was right. We didn't actually talk about the steps, but what I had to do was what I had to do. And that was it. I pulled up my big boy pants, ripped off the proverbial Band-Aid, as they say, and I started doing what I had to do, which ruffled all kinds of feathers, created all kinds of chaos, but within, a couple of months, it was over. Yeah. So I could have gone on and on and on for years and years of more pain, or I could have just accepted, like, you know what? I'm responsible for the fact that I'm responding to this person this way. They're throwing the bombs out. I'm being reactionary. Wait a minute. This isn't their problem. This is my problem.
And I feel like the reactivity is such a contributor to that victim mentality, because I lived in it for years. Why me? Why is nothing that I'm doing working? Why am I so exhausted? Why can't I find something that I like to do? And it's just, because something comes up and it's like you react to it. Like there's no processing. It just hits you and you hit back. And then your mind is like, oh my goodness, why does this happen to you? You're such a good person. Like you work so hard. And it's exhausting and it burns out your energy. But now, like looking back at it, I'm like, why does this happen to you? Because you put yourself in this situation.
Well, that's exactly it. And what I realized was that I had the wrong business systems. And what I was just doing was creating more work for me, more work for my partner, my wife, Stephanie. And this was, that was the impetus for change. So I'm like, okay, that business, I'm shutting that division down and I'm focusing on this one because this one is scalable and has systems, which, leading into your story of how we met, which was the understanding that I was never going to grow my business off of people per se, until I had systems. So Heather, you've built and scaled multiple businesses. What was the point where you realized that working harder really wasn't actually paying off or getting you anywhere?
Well, just quick correction, because I'm always going to be super honest. I have helped other people build and scale multiple businesses. Mine, I've only done a few. But the thing with the grinding harder, and I realized that it's a lot to do with the psychology of it, right? And when we get into that reaction mode, our reaction drives what we do next. And some people just quit. We've seen that, right? You've got your people that something comes up and they're like, screw this, I'm out, which is not great. And then most of the people who are ambitious, they have big goals. That's not their reaction. Their reaction is, I'm going to out-earn this problem. I'm going to outwork this problem. I'm going to outdo this problem. And a lot of the times I started realizing, like, looking back, I didn't need to get that emotional about things. Like I would take on other people's emotions. And like, if a client of mine, I would, their house build got delayed by 3 weeks and they were going to have to drop $1,000 on an Airbnb, and I'm owning that emotion and I'm thinking I'm going to work harder, but there's really nothing I can do. The builder's building the house, the lender's lending the money, the title company is processing the title. And so I'm owning all of this emotion and reacting when, let's be honest here, if you're a realtor, if you're in any kind of sales, the builder's always going to delay the build. And instead, I could have said, hey, when the builder delays the build, here's how I'm going to react. And so I started learning that if I knew what was going to happen beforehand and I already had the steps planned out for how to handle it, all of a sudden, instead of reacting by just working harder, I started to be like, well, I know what to do. Right? And a lot of us gain this experience just through sheer force, right? These things happen to you, you freak out, and then the next time it happens, you freak out less. It's like paying your anxiety dues. But I started realizing that I didn't need to pay my dues if I just wrote down what was going to happen and decided how I was going to deal with it before it did. And then I started realizing that you could do that for almost anything. Like, instead of being overwhelmed and embarrassed when my kid has a tantrum in the middle of the grocery store and everybody's judging me and looking at me like I'm a bad mom, I know that as a mother, there is a high likelihood that my kid's going to have a tantrum in a grocery store at one point in my life. What am I going to do about it? Well, I have decided now that I'm going to let her feel her feelings and I'm going to plop her in the cart and she can have her tantrum while I walk around until she calms down, and then we'll talk about it and they can judge me if they want. And so now if that happens, I don't feel embarrassed. And that works for so many people. Leaders, if you know what you're going to do, you don't get as freaked out. Employees, same thing. If they know what they're supposed to do, they don't get freaked out.
Yeah, I used to say all the time, like, oh my God, don't embarrass me in front of the strangers. And I'll say that usually out loud in front of the strangers. Now with the age of the phones and videos, maybe that's not always great. That you could get yourself recorded in one of those spots. But the reality is, you're right. Look, first of all, everyone's going to judge you anyway. Mm-hmm. There's not a single parent in a grocery store with a screaming child that I have never thought, Ben, that kid's a pain in the ass. So it's okay. You're going to get judged. And of course, it happened to my kids too. And it's a circle of life. It was my kids that were annoying the shit out of everyone at one point. Now it's your kids that are doing it. It's just part of the circle of life.
And that's the thing is, so like I started realizing this in my life, and then I started applying it not just to mine though, because if I'm leading, if I'm showing the way, and my clients are the drivers of their business, then they're the ones responsible for deciding how things should be handled in their business. If you want it handled a certain way, you need to decide that beforehand. which helps your employees. So you can tell your employees when a customer calls in angry, because that's going to happen, here's what I want you to do. And then it gets to a certain point where you need to just give it to me. And just by lining that out, all of a sudden, instead of just like, oh, I'm going to deal with it, I'm going to figure it out, I'm going to go to the boss, work harder, that hustle calms down, because it's not hustle anymore. It's not reactivity that drives anxiety. It's a plan. And you can actually start to see in that plan, where does things go off the rails here? And how can we mitigate that before it happens? So just by putting something on paper, you start to see where you can stop hustling so much, where we could implement systems, where we could implement ways to make this easier, because let's just assume it's going to happen.
Well, and that's a good point, because when you started, talk about starting focusing on those processes and systems and leveraging time instead of just adding more hours. I think we have been as a culture trained in this idea of like how much my time is worth, right? Most people are working either an hourly or a salary job. Most of the people who are probably listening to this podcast are probably someone who's in a job or doing something they don't want to be doing and wishes they were doing something else. Or they've just started, or they're young in business, or they're newer in business, or maybe they're struggling in business and they're trying to get out of being in their own business. But either way, if you're listening, this is because you want something more. And that's what we're here to talk about, is the leveraging of time and success. I have said something. There were years that I felt really guilty about what I'm about to say, but I would often say, the less I work, the more money I make.
And I think
this became a mantra of mine, Heather, for years. And of course, the subconscious is going to work that. But when I stopped fighting the system, I started letting the system work for me, and I let it started flowing. It's amazing how my business and life have turned around since.
It's like that TikTok I sent to you and Stephanie yesterday that was basically like, the people who glorify the grind, they're the ones that are trying to beat the system. And you can beat the system, but it takes immense discipline, immense amount of work, and they're making it work for them. Or you could go with the flow.
Heather, this is one of those movies where I'm hoping that the generations ahead will still watch it, but it's Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
And if you ever watch Groundhog Day, like there have been college classes taught on the Groundhog Day movie, and they were basically wondering how long had he been in there, right, to become a concert pianist and to do all these things. But what I always took away from that was, one, he was trying to craft the perfect day, which I think there's a spiritual part of that too. But if you think about it, right, like every day, from a hustle grind mentality, he would wake up knowing the chain of events that he had to go through to do all the things he had to do to save the kid from falling, to help the people out, right? But in real life, we would lead that to what? Burnout.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I'm saying is like, so I have a very hard time. I get very easily caught up in games, and I have to be very careful because I'm a little OCD that way. Because the games are designed to just keep you coming back and clicking for more, and you start to realize that and what happens is the game starts for me being fun, and then it starts to become a little bit of work, and then I start to dread it. And when I start to dread playing it, that's when I knew it's over.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the thing. So people find themselves caught in this trap and they want to get out of it. And then we hear stuff like, work smarter, not harder. Or the 80-20 rule is like one of the most popular principles in business. Pareto's principle says 20% of the effort drives 80% of the results. And I think people get, like, those are nice, flashy statements, but it's like a comedian. When you go up to a comedian on the street and you're like, say something funny.
Right.
And it's like, okay, that's not how it works. So when people say 20% of the efforts drive 80% of the results, or work smarter, not harder, I find that a lot of people kind of do the freeze reaction of like, okay, but what does it mean? What is the 20%? What is smarter?
Okay, so I'll give you an example of that. When I started off, it was just chasing the money. Mm-hmm. Right? If I just earn more money, if I just keep earning more money, that, like, it was always like if I just could earn a little bit more money. But what you realize is like as you expand your money, so does your problems. So in a sense, it's like nature hates a void, as they say. Nature hates a vacuum. So if you have extra money, there's like, okay, well, let's fill that space. That could be with increasing your lifestyle, or it could be that your kids are getting older, have new expense. It could be anything. But the point is, very rarely does finding more money ever resolve people's problems. So what I realized when you talk about the 80-20 rule, what I really realized is when I started teaching time value, and this was a big one. I'm not the first one to teach it, but I certainly was like trying to get my clients in property management to understand like what they were getting for their monthly fee was far less than what they would spend in the mental mind time and energy managing for themselves. And so when you talk about the 80-20, what they mean by that is just think about your own life, right? When you start off as a new homeowner, let's just say you're a new homeowner and you don't have a lot of money, right? So you're going to do everything. You're going to mow your own lawn, you're going to clean your own house, you're going to be your own handyman, you're going to be your own painter, you might even be your own contractor and electrician for small jobs around the property. Well, as you start to grow and your time value becomes worth more, what you realize is like, okay, well, now I'm making more money per hour than what it would cost for me to hire the plumber. So I'm just going to hire the plumber now and leverage. So now I'm making more money and I'm leveraging. But here's what happens. People who, particularly people who have grown up in poverty situations, who do not, and that's no fault of their own, but there's typically a lack, a fear of lack and a fear of loss. And what happens is, even though their income goes up, they still feel like, well, this is how I'm saving money. So I'm taking care of the plumbing and I'm mowing the lawn on the weekend. So think about it, right? From an 80-20, right? They're not making any money doing the 80% of the chores around the household. If they spent 20% of their time working an extra shift or an hour or two at their job, they'd probably earn the money and leverage the other 80% of their time they could have used freely. So that's what they mean by the 80-20. It doesn't mean like all businesses should only run on the 20%. It's just that you realize in your job as a business owner, in the job that you're doing, what you have to ask yourself is, man, how much of this is really going to affect my day and potentially bring me more income versus which is just me dotting I's and crossing T's because it feels good.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to know, because in real estate, it's really clear. What is your dollar productive activity? What is the stuff that is bringing in revenue? Because ultimately, leverage, that's what money pays for. It pays for employees to do things that you can't or don't want to do. And it pays for systems, tools, things that you need to get your employees to actually function. So really identifying in your business, in your job, what are the dollar productive activities that you contribute to and you do really well. And I think this is something I've seen a disconnect in too. What is it that you do really well? It may not be the thing that you love most in the world. I love crafting. I kind of suck at it. That's not a dollar productive activity. That's a giving myself energy back. But what do you do that people comment on? And especially for women, it's like we're almost afraid to acknowledge what we're great at because we're supposed to be humble. We're supposed to be, oh no,
demure.
It's not that big. Demure, yes. But you look at it and it's like, what's your 20%? And you're like, I don't know. Okay, well, that's where you start. You start by finding your 20%. And you find that by, just logic. What's your dollar productive activities in your business? If you're a plumber, it's finding people who need plumbing needs. If you're a business coach, it's finding business owners who need processes in their business. And that's one thing, right? That's just a thing. But then it's figuring out, what are you awesome at? What do people always tell you that you're doing great? And how do you marry those two things? So like for me, for years, people would tell me, I love your energy. I love your energy. And I was like, great. I would love it if you paid me for that.
Right.
I don't know how to monetize my energy, right? Sure. So I did a lot of work. I was like, what does that energy mean and how does it relate to my 20%? And I started to realize, well, if people really love my energy, well, then I can use that to drive the dollar productive activity in my business. And the dollar productive activity for me is meeting with people. So if I can make people want to meet with me by sharing my energy, then I will get more meetings and I will get more business. So really, what is your dollar productive activity and what are you awesome at? And then figuring out a way to make those one and the same thing that you do consistently all the time. And that's where you're going to find your 20%. And if you lean into it, it's going to lead to way higher results.
Well, and it is true because, that and everything you're doing, you find your niche and that's what you work on. And you start to really learn that the people who actually make it aren't the ones who work the hardest. They're the ones who work the smartest. Mm-hmm. And you're going to constantly feel like almost like a fraud because of it. Because it doesn't seem to make sense that if I work less, I somehow make more money. But think of it from a business owner perspective, right? If I'm constantly being bombarded 80% of my day, putting out little fires, how am I focused on growth? Mm-hmm. How am I focused on the connections? How am I focused on the big vision? And so part of my goals for 2024 and 2025 working with the team was that, guys, I'm stepping way back from the daily operation on this. Like, I'm empowering you, as all business owners should, to let their people make mistakes. And I've said this time and time again. I did not hire you to be perfect. I understand. I prefer if you don't make mistakes, but mistakes are going to happen. All I ask is if you make a mistake, you own it immediately. Figure out what you've learned from it and give me a solution to how we're going to rectify it. And so what'll happen is old habits when you make a mistake in business, like I'll get into a conversation with an employee and you'll see that natural defense of like, I don't want to admit that I effed this up. But then they understand who they're talking to, and they know that the punishment will be far worse if you avoid ownership of the problem. So it's like, just take it. Yeah, you know what, Chris? And I'll get the call now. Chris, I want you to know I really screwed this up. This is the mistake I made. Blah, 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 blah. This is what I have from it, and here's how I'm going to fix it for you. Okay. Now, how am I going to be mad at that call?
Absolutely.
Even if it costs me money. I mean, even if it costs me money, it sucks, but okay.
But it's a lot less likely to happen again if you're not piling guilt and shame. And I feel like, too, a lot of business owners, they glorify the fact that they're doing so many things. Like, I know when I was in the thick of it in real estate, I'd be like, oh, yeah, I worked 90 hours a week this week. As if it was a point of pride, right? Exactly. And it's like we feel like we're doing something. We're building something because we're working 90 hours a week. But then it's also like hard to let go of anything because they lack the trust in their team. They lack that giving autonomy to the team and trusting that they're going to come back and own it when they make mistakes. So we really need to stop glorifying that busy and focus on where am I stuck in this mud and where can I start pulling myself out and handing it over. And I think that's the first step is if you're constantly too busy and you don't have enough time a day, it's not a workload problem, it's a clarity problem.
Think of it this way. We'll call it the dead man switch, all right? And I don't know if you know this or not, but on trains, there's something called a dead man switch. And basically you have to push this button like every 60 seconds or every 2 minutes, because if you don't, the train computer says, well, okay, the train conductor must be dead, and therefore we're going to start the auto stop systems. In fact, when we were just on the cruise ship last month, we did the bridge tour, and like every 2 minutes, all of a sudden, I heard this beep, 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 and the guy would have to walk all the way over and push the button. The third time it happened, I kind of said, hey, is that your dead man switch? And he was like, yeah, it is. He was like kind of impressed that I knew. I'm like, yeah, that's to say if this ship's on autopilot, is anybody on board? If not, it'll go through the shutdown. Well, guess what? In life, if you have a business that requires you to keep hitting that dead man switch, then now you have a job. Mm-hmm. And so what I looked at it was like, think about those games, right? The ones where you like the burger makers, right? You know, make the burger, make the fries, make the drinks. It's fun in the beginning, but eventually you get too many customers.
Yeah.
And then you start to swamp and drown trying to make all these orders in the game. Now the game's no longer fun. And I'm like, what the hell? I've become a mechanical burger maker on this game. What am I doing with my life? Get back to work, Christopher. But my point is, like, it's just like in real life. People just say, well, I'll just take this little extra job on here. And I'll take this little extra job on here. And I had to have a very tough conversation with my wife and partner because she doesn't see the vision that I have or think the way I think, which is fine. I didn't marry her to be just like me. But I was like, finally, about a year and a half ago, I finally say, you don't understand. Like, I have to work less so that we can make more.
Exactly.
Because it's the only way for me to grow is for me to literally step out of these systems. And I always went off that line, like, if you can't walk away from your business for 3 months. I'm pretty close at this point. I'm pretty close at this point to be able to walk away for 3 months and come back and everything is running, if not as good, it should be running better. And I know that's such a proverbial thing to say, but it really is there. I can't believe I'm almost at that point. From a legal perspective, I'm still needed. I don't really have those systems set up, but I'm one broker of record away in PA from legally being able to say, okay, I'm hands off 100%.
But I think that's impressive. And the thing is, like, there's no autopilot forever in business. Like, there's a point of diminishing return. You've got to keep an eye on things, accountability and stuff, right? It's fine. But checking in for a few hours a week is so different from jumping in and having to take the reins and get it back on course and spend all that energy and effort. So I think that's super impressive. When did you actually define that, this was your definition of success, was having a business that could run without you?
Boy, I got to tell you, that is a good one. I will often tell people one of my childhood memories being at the Franklin Institute. It's a science museum, and my dad would take us a lot when we were kids, and I was a little nerd. But up on the 4th floor, I think it was, in this one corner, they had this physics demonstration, and it was a big steel I-beam, and you would walk on one end of it, and there was a big 3-inch gym rope hanging down, and you could just kind of pull on this thing, and thanks to leverage, the way the lever worked, over on the other end where the beam went to, it would lift like a pallet of sandbags weighing like 800, 1,000, 1,200 pounds. And I was like, this is my dad, like, this is leverage. Look, you look, just with your hand, you can just gently pull on this rope and look what you're doing over there. And that stuck in my head. I was like, leverage. Okay. And I was also a math kid. I always knew, like, okay, well, math. And so what happened was, you read these stories and you're like, well, Henry Ford understood it. Like, if you can maximize efficiency. So in the back of my mind, I always knew that the only way I would ever truly be successful is if I figured out a way to leverage my time. But I also then was fighting society's desires and norms and standards to say, no, go get your 9 to 5, work Monday through Friday, enjoy your weekends, because that's what life means. And believe you me, when you're part of the 10 to 20% versus the 80% who are doing W-2 life versus the 20% who are out there slinging on their own, it's tough. Because 8 out of 10 of your friends work for a job. So it's hard to work on it. So when you say, when did I finally realize it? I would say that I have probably known my entire life.
Oh, wow. See, that... I don't relate to that because I was ready to be that 8 to 5er. I wanted stability and just
don't you remember? Yeah, do you remember the story of the grasshopper and the ants when we were kids? Mm-hmm. And then we talk about the lazy grasshopper while the ants
it was like the turtle and the hare. Are you talking about?
No, the tortoise and the hare.
Oh yeah, the lazy grasshopper who just played.
It was like the lazy grasshopper. I was the lazy grasshopper. He was upset because the ants toiled all summer putting their food stocks away, and the grasshopper didn't. And the moral of the story, I think, if I remember correctly, now I feel silly, was like, I think in the end it was like, the ants were happy. And the
ants survived the winter and the grasshopper died, Chris.
I was like, if the grasshopper just goes over and, kills a few ants or takes over a mound. And so here's the point. If you can imagine this little son of a bitch, like, I'm being serious, Heather, I never saw the story that way. I was like, that's a smart grasshopper. Okay?
And I was I'm going to survive the winter.
Heather, I'm telling you something I've never admitted out public in my entire life. When I'd read that story as a kid, I'd be like, grasshopper seems pretty smart to me.
But you're sitting here living the life, having created a perpetually food-generating winter storage unit.
It's just a money. The way I said it was, it's a money wheel, guys. That's all we're doing. Is creating a money wheel. Just create a money wheel. Just keep spitting more money off. The real questions are, could I have had it sooner? Probably. What obstacles did I put in my way that prevented it? And that was me creating my own obstacles. Whenever I started deleveraging myself, my life got harder and more difficult. And then I have to remind myself it was time to re-engage. And it is very difficult because you don't want to... First of all, you have to be careful because society does not like someone who makes money without a lot of effort or something like psychologically. They're happy if you win the lottery, but God forbid you create a system that pays you money while you sleep.
Yeah, you're the evil landlord.
Oh yes. I create jobs. I pay taxes. You're just the evil man. Dude, I create jobs. There's two people in this world. There's makers and takers. You either make jobs for people or you take jobs from people. That's it. And I've always rather be on the maker side than the taker side. And so for me, my whole life, I just kind of knew from a very young age that I felt that the standard life path that was being sold from the time I was in junior high to high school was bullshit.
And see, I'm the opposite, but that's I think the interesting thing, because we've got so many people out there who always have it in the back of their mind that things are bullshit, but they still end up somewhere they don't want to be, right? They end up in a job that they hate or in a business that's running them ragged. And then you've got people like me who we're completely happy to live in the system. We're completely happy to have the stability and be a taker. And then something happened that kind of jarred us off the rails. And now we're like, oh crap, I have control of our life. So it's two very different ways to come about it. But that's the funny thing is you got to start when you realize it. And I think really just redefining, because if you had made that realization and decided you were going to be Grant Cardone, you would still be chasing that because he has to work a ridiculous amount. I mean, yes, he probably has leverage now, but that's just not a vision of success I'm interested in. And you got really clear, my vision of success is, living in Florida, having a pool, being able to have the time freedom that I want. And
you said it right there. That's the number one right there, time. Before everything else, I wanted my time. Mm-hmm. I am greedy for my even if I'm wasting it, it's my time to waste.
Yep.
And I hated being told, sit in this chair. The thought that I was in high school, goddamn near 18 years old, I could go fight in a war for this country, but I got to sit there and hold my hand up to ask permission to go take a tinkle? Come on.
Take a tinkle.
Come on. This is what I'm saying. You expect that you're creating adulthood here? And this was why I started to realize, the system was messed up. But the point is, the system is where people are. So and by the way, I want to say something when I said about the makers and takers. There's nothing wrong. The world needs the 80%. Lots of people want to work these jobs, and there's great satisfaction in having a job. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm talking to the people who are on that blend that are I know I'm in the 80, but I'd really rather be in the 20. Those are the people I'm talking about. There are many, many people. It doesn't matter, man. They're I would. How many times have I heard it, Steph? I would never want to run. I would never want to do that. I'm happy. Yes, I know I could lose my job, but I'm okay with that, and that is fine. But I'm talking to the people who are on that cusp, or they're in that business and they're going, and we've seen this. I don't want to say the kind of people, but it's I'll watch them. They'll grow a business, and 5 years later, they might sell it for pennies on the dollar, or they just wrap up and call it a day. It wasn't a business. It was just a job.
Well, and there's so many. I mean, Cody Sanchez's whole platform is about this, about how many boomers are out there that are getting to retirement age, and they're either going to sell their business or they're simply going to shut the doors because they created businesses without the idea of leverage in mind. It was I'm going to open a hotel, live in it, and run it kind of thing, instead of opening a hotel, hiring someone to manage it, scaling it up, getting another one, and being able to be separated from that. But that's the thing. These boomers were business owners, but they were just business owners that kind of did it because they were supposed to back then, and there was really no freedom strategy to it. And I think that's the biggest takeaway here is grinding harder isn't the strategy. In order to have a strategy, you need to just have that clarity on what is success, what is the result I'm driving, and what are the things that have the most impact on driving that result. That's what's going to get you to where you are, Chris, versus just ending up in, and you're in property management. A lot of property managers find themselves at 100, 150 units, and they're swamped. They're exhausted. They can't find good people. They never go out to lead generate because they're way too busy managing the 150.
But not only
properties
that,
they have.
now they've created a business where they need to feed off that income. So what they would normally do is leverage their time and hire people to do it. But you can't do that because you become so accustomed to eating everything. Like now you're eating the kill. Mm-hmm. And I've said that. I said if I could go back and do it all over again, I probably would have encouraged Stephanie to stay in the workforce for the health insurance because that is super expensive. Created the business that we're doing now, but I would have invested 100% of it right back into the business. And we probably would have grown a lot faster. Now, shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Yeah.
So easy. It doesn't
20/20
matter.
hindsight.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? And I said to a lot of people, look, I put a roof over my head. It paid for vacations. It kept my kids in sports. So, did I live a good life from that with my kids? Yeah. And I think that you had the nail on the head, which is, understanding what that definition is. And I want to remind people that, if you really pen your idea that you're going for freedom, stop thinking about the big luxury homes or the fancy sports cars. I'm saying, what you want to buy first and foremost is your time. And if you want to buy your time freedom, then that's where you have to calculate, what does my life cost me if I don't even show up for work? Mm-hmm. Mortgage, rent, utilities, car payments, add it all up, and hopefully you do. And that's the number. Let's say that number is $8,000 a month. Well, it's okay, well, now that's your passive number that you need to get.
Yeah, it's very basic, rich dad, poor dad, Robert Kiyosaki. But at the end of the day, if we recap kind of the most useful information that we've got here, it's that working harder is not the answer. It's not. The most successful people don't grind endlessly. And in order to start breaking free from this hustle mentality, you need to do two things. You need to get really clear on what your version of success is. What is your priority? What is your freedom number? What is your 5 years from now if everything went right? What does that look like? And then getting really clear on what are the actual dollar productive activities that drive that. And if you have those things well defined, then you can pour into the dollar productive activities that'll start giving you progress toward where you want to be.
Absolutely. Listen, final thoughts coming up here. If your only strategy is to grind harder, you don't have a strategy. And we all have seen those scenes in the movie where it's can you give the engine just a little bit more, Captain? And we all know what happens, right? At some point, the engine explodes because it can't. And that is you. That's your time. That's your life, right? You can't grind harder. There's only so much of you to give. Mm-hmm. And don't make your life and health the first thing that's going to break when you over.
And I would challenge everybody listening to know what that number is. Know how much money you need to be bringing in on a monthly basis without doing anything in order to meet your basic needs. Pay your mortgage, pay your food bills, pay your electricity. What's your freedom number? And it doesn't need to be $2,000 a month. It can be $10,000 a month. Yeah, it's going to be a little longer to get there, but if you know that number, all of a sudden it gets easier to define your dollar productive activities and build a plan. So that's what I would challenge people today to do is calculate it. Figure out what your average monthly expenses are going to be, and that'll start giving you the clarity to figure out how you're going to go about building that. All right?
Sweet, good stuff. I love this. So,
next time we're talking about how to stop being the bottleneck in your own business so you can actually start getting your time back. I'm excited about talking about that.
All right, well, sweet. Subscribe, share this with a friend who needs to hear it. DM us if you're ready to ditch the hustle trap. Always happy to talk to other fellows out there who are looking to get in and out of the hustle. Remember, your time has value. Don't ever forget that. See you guys on the next call.
All right, have a good one, guys. Woo!